Welcome back once again as we continue our study in the book of Daniel. And before we look into the text, let's look to the Lord in prayer. Father, thank you again for the delight that it is every time that we open your word. We thank you for the fact that the interpretation of it is directed by your Spirit, Lord, and we ask that you would do that today in such a way that not only do we understand and grasp the historical significance of what Daniel is writing about, but also the eschatological significance, the looking into the future from Nebuchadnezzar's time as well as even from our time today. And for this, we give you thanks and praise in Christ's name. Amen. All right, we're in Daniel chapter 2, and wanted to start reading at verse 37. You know, this Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and there are a couple of significant things about this dream that we really have to kind of keep front and center. Number one, the significance isn't that he had a dream. The significance is that God gave him the dream. This wasn't just I lay down at night, ate too much pizza, and I started having crazy dreams. God gave him this dream, so it was a God-inspired dream. The second significance to it is, and Nebuchadnezzar didn't understand this yet. God was giving him, revealing to him in this dream a thumbnail sketch, if you will, of what was coming ahead for the world. Now, he kind of, when I say thumbnail, this is just a real brief thing here in chapter 2. Once we get back to chapter 7 in Daniel, though, we'll be looking at we'll be looking down into the details of what Nebuchadnezzar is seeing a little bit more specifically. So Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. Now, when Daniel addresses him, he says a couple things that's kind of interesting here. Verse 37, he says, "You, O king, are the king of kings." The king of kings. Now, you know, we're aware that that's a phrase that's often used of Christ, being the king of kings. Why would it be used of Nebuchadnezzar, though? You know, what was there special about Nebuchadnezzar? You know, interesting thing, when empires were constantly changing hands in ancient times. One empire would rise to power, take over a certain amount of geographical area, then they would start becoming weaker. Most of them was because they were trying to spread out too much territory. You know, that was what happened to Rome. Anybody ever been to Hadrian's Wall in England? Anybody ever seen Hadrian's Wall? Hadrian's Wall, which is funny, it's in England, and people say, how in the world is it? England is a big island that's not even connected to Europe. Why would an emperor have a wall in England? Well, the reason was Rome was constantly in a process of expanding its territory. So they would conquer one place after another to add to their territory. And sadly for them, when you do that, you only have so many troops. Now you can keep trying to add troops, but there's a finite number of soldiers that you can have from any area. And so as they were expanding their territory, they would have to leave so many soldiers here to take control of an area and then send so many soldiers to the next area to conquer it and take control of it. Well, sooner or later, you're going to spread out your army so thin that you really start to lose your power. And that's what happened to Rome. And so the Emperor Hadrian, by the time that Rome had gotten all the way, you know, we started in Italy, in Rome, Italy, where the center of the empire is. By the time you get over to Rome, you've already gotten out into the water, over into the big island, or not Rome, England. You get over into England, you're miles and miles away from home, and by the time the Romans got there, their army had been spread so thin, the hordes up north were starting to come down and attack them, and so Hadrian had this wall built in order to kind of mark a border for the Roman Empire. So that was a common practice. This expanding territory and becoming weaker was a common practice for empires. So when Nebuchadnezzar would go in and attack a country, say, he had a couple of choices. Well, how do you take over a country? Well, he could have told his troops, we're going to go into this country, attack the capital city, we're going to take it down, and then I want you to kill everybody. That was one option, kill everybody. The problem with that is you end up with a whole bunch of land and nobody there to occupy it. So it's empty real estate, which doesn't really do your empire any good. Nebuchadnezzar was too smart to do that, and so what he would do when he would take over conquer a people, and he did this in Israel, by the way, he did this in Jerusalem to the Jewish king. When he would take over a people, he would say, okay, here we win, you lose. Here's the deal. I'm going to leave you as used to be the king of this place. I'm going to leave you as a vassal, V-A-S-S-A-L. It was kind of a sub-king, an under-king. And Nebuchadnezzar would say, so you're no longer the main king, I'm the main king, but you're a sub-king under me, and so all you have to do is pay your taxes every year, and then behave yourself, things will be good, which Jerusalem had agreed to that, and then they reneged on it, which is why Nebuchadnezzar had to keep coming back and attacking over and over. So every time Nebuchadnezzar's empire would overtake another country, another people, another nation, they would end up with a king, whoever the king of that place was, serving Nebuchadnezzar. And so Nebuchadnezzar then was the king over that king. And so that happened over and over again, and this is why Daniel says, you are the king of kings. All the countries that have kings in them where you have conquered, you're the king that's running all the other kings. You are the king of kings. Then he also makes the point in verse 37, you're the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory. That had to be an interesting statement to Nebuchadnezzar, right? He's thinking, man, I got the greatest army in the world. Nobody is as good as us. Nobody can withstand us. Every place that we go, our army defeats the enemy. We take over that country. Can you imagine as years go by and as kingdoms are falling to Nebuchadnezzar, pride would begin to take over in his life. Like there's nobody that can stand against us. And so Daniel just makes this little point. You're the king of kings to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom. You are where you are. And you have the capability that you have because God has made it so. Now, at this point, Nebuchadnezzar hasn't yet come to the place of recognizing that, but he's being introduced to that concept now. You're the one that's in charge of all the kings, but the reason is because God has put you there. In verse 38, he says, and then wherever the sons of men dwell, wherever people dwell, or the beasts of the field, the birds of the sky, he has given them everything, all of them, into your hand, has caused you to rule over them all. And so there's got to be some reevaluation on Nebuchadnezzar's part as exactly what part he plays in God's plan. It's not God playing in his plan, it's him playing in God's plan. And then at the very end of the verse, and this is what really starts everything, the end of the verse, he says, you are the head of gold. So remember the dream, right? This massive form. And again, as I mentioned last week, don't think of this as a statue. Think of this as the form of somebody, human-looking form. He sees this massive form, so big, so impending, so immediate that Nebuchadnezzar, this brave king that had conquered all these empires, nothing scared him, and he was terrified when he saw this picture in his dream. Kind of ironic, isn't it? The most powerful king on the earth that anybody knew of is terrified when he sees this figure in his dream. So there's this figure, the head of gold, right? The chest and the arms of silver, and then the belly and thighs, it says bronze. Some translate that as brass, which probably is what it was, and then the legs of iron, the feet of iron and clay. So he sees this massive thing. Doesn't have a clue yet as to what it is, but this single statement sets it off. Says, you are the head of gold. In other words, when you look at that form that you saw in your dream, Nebuchadnezzar, look at that head. That represents you. Now, interesting, that doesn't mean that that head represented Nebuchadnezzar the person. Because if you read the next verse, verse 39, so 38, he ends by saying, you are the head of gold. In verse 39, it says, after you will arise another kingdom. He doesn't say after you will arise another king. He says after you will arise another kingdom. And so Nebuchadnezzar, it isn't Nebuchadnezzar the king that's in picture here. It's Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom that's in picture here. When he says you are the head of gold, he's saying you, the Babylonian Empire, are the head of gold. And after this empire, then he says after you will arise another kingdom. Think of the implications of that. Here's Nebuchadnezzar, the head of this massive empire, looking out across his empire thinking, this is all me. It's all mine. Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel says, well, not quite. It belongs to you because God has given it to you. The good news, Nebuchadnezzar, you're King of Kings. The good news, God has given you the power over this entire empire. The good news. And then he says, by the way, after you, there will arise another kingdom. What's the implication of that? Your kingdom isn't going to last forever. And again, once again, he's not addressing Nebuchadnezzar the person, he's addressing Nebuchadnezzar the head of the kingdom. And so Daniel says, after you, there will arise another kingdom. Someone is going to take over your kingdom, which had to, at that point, had to blow Nebuchadnezzar's mind. What do you mean? Someone's going to take over this kingdom. We've taken over everything. But who else is there? What we're going to read here is that what was constantly happening in ancient times is one kingdom was just getting started and just starting to rise, just starting to become more powerful. Another kingdom was starting to become weaker. So at some point, Daniel wasn't telling them when, at some point, this power of this empire, this Babylonian empire, was going to start to wane, and this other empire was going to start to wax. It says, after you there will arise another kingdom. Well, obviously, he has to be thinking when he's seeing this picture, this form in his dream. Okay, here's this head of gold. Nebuchadnezzar's got to be smart enough now to figure, okay, if my kingdom is the head of gold, and Daniel says, after you will arise another kingdom, now you're looking at the chest and the arms of silver. Not identified yet, but he says there's another kingdom. Another thing he says that's interesting is, he says, after you there will rise another kingdom inferior to you. Inferior to you. That's got to cause an awful lot of head scratching. Inferior to you. Wait a minute. So if you have two kingdoms that are on a battlefield, two armies that are on the battlefield, one army, each army represents its own kingdom, right? So you have these two kingdoms that are doing battle. And one kingdom defeats the other kingdom. Their army wins. Which one of those kingdoms would you call superior, and which one would you call inferior? The kingdom that won is superior, right? The kingdom that is defeated is inferior. But Daniel says, after you there will rise another kingdom. In other words, there's a kingdom coming that's going to take over for your kingdom, and that kingdom is going to be inferior to you. How in the world can that possibly make sense? You see, the inferiority and the superiority that Daniel's talking about isn't strength. It's not power, because obviously the kingdom that takes over from Nebuchadnezzar has to be a stronger kingdom, right? Has to be stronger, not weaker. But the inferiority has nothing to do with strength. The inferiority has to do with the government of that kingdom, the purity of the governing of that king. Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom of all the kingdoms on the face of the earth up until that time, was the most pure. And when I say pure, I don't mean holy by any means. They were pagans, right? They were worshiping false gods, a whole bunch of them. So the purity there doesn't have anything to do with holiness. The purity is in the purity of the government, in the sense that when Nebuchadnezzar was in charge of the Babylonian Empire, whatever he said happened. When he made a decree, remember when he called all the wise men and all the conjurers, the magicians, and all the people to come in and interpret the dream? And remember that little scenario? And they said, well, you tell us what the dream is, we'll tell you what it means. And he says, no, you're going to tell me what it means, or you're going to tell me what it is first, then tell me what it means. And they say, we can't do that. Nobody can do that. Nebuchadnezzar basically says, well, you better do that, or I'm going to kill you all. And when they couldn't do it, he put out an execution order on every one of them. That's why they went to get Daniel, because Daniel was one of those that was in that party, in that company of the wise men. Daniel was about to be executed as well. So whenever Nebuchadnezzar said something in the kingdom, there was no debate. There was no Supreme Court. There was no appellate process. Whatever he said happened. If he said something wasn't to happen, it didn't happen. Nebuchadnezzar was a powerful king. The next kingdom that came into power, and that's the one he's talking about there in verse 39, there will arise another kingdom inferior to you. That was a kingdom headed by Cyrus the Great. It was the Medo-Persian Empire. The Medo-Persian Empire. 539 BC, it was kind of interesting in history. Up until 539, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian kingdom had been running everything, basically. Nebuchadnezzar passed away, and the next king became king, and next king. Finally, a guy by the name of Nabonidus was on the throne, third chronologically, after Nebuchadnezzar. Nabonidus is on the throne. And Cyrus the Great marches his army of the Medes and the Persians. That was an amalgamated empire. The Medes and the Persians was two peoples, the Medes and the Persians, came together, made an empire. Cyrus the Great is leading that empire. 539, he marches into Babylon. Remember, the Babylonian Empire, the capital of the Babylonian Empire was Babylon. Here comes Cyrus with his army, marches into Babylon, and takes over. The Babylonian Empire fell that day in 539. The Medo-Persians now were running everything. Cyrus the Great was the king. But there was a difference in the governing and the structure and the way that things were governed between the Babylonian Empire and the Medo-Persian Empire, and that was this. The Medo-Persians, they had something of a constitution where they would, if the king made a decree, it was interesting, the king, just like Nebuchadnezzar made a decree in the Babylonian Empire, and it was carried out. The king in the Medo-Persian Empire could also make a decree. When he made a decree, they wrote it down. It became part of the Constitution. The Constitution was constantly changing, kind of like the Constitution that we have in our country today. Whoever's in power as a Democrat gets to change the Constitution, which is nuts, but that's what was happening then. So whenever the Medo-Persian Empire, the king would make a decree, they would write it down. The next day, or the next week, or the next month, all of a sudden the king says, oh man, I made a mistake. That was a stupid thing. Everybody forget about that decree I made 2 weeks ago. I changed my mind. And they would say, no, you don't do that. Because once it's been written as a decree, it becomes the law of the land. Even the king didn't have the authority to change the law of the land. And so in that sense, the governing of the Medo-Persian Empire wasn't as pure or as straight or whatever you want to call it, as was the governing of the Babylonian Empire. The king of the Medo-Persian Empire, once he made a decree, he couldn't even change it if he wanted to. And we'll see that later as it affects Daniel's life. So after you will rise another kingdom inferior to you. We know that was the Medo-Persian Empire because in 539 BC, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Babylonian Empire fell. The Medo-Persian Empire was now in power. And this literally happened in history. And it's not just in the Bible, it's in history records. That literally happened. A lot of Bible critics have looked at that because of the fact that it literally came about exactly like Daniel predicted. They've said, there's no way in the world that Daniel could have written this when he wrote it, because it didn't happen for several years. Daniel must have been written later. That's what critics have said. Of course, that's not true. Then to compound things, look at verse 39 again. It says, after you will rise another kingdom inferior to you, then another third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth. Which will rule over all the earth. There was a young guy who had become king. His father was the king of the Macedonian Empire, Philip of Macedon. His son, name we're all familiar with, Alexander, who when Philip died, Alexander took over. And he was a young guy, and he was a brilliant tactician. Amazing. Nobody could defeat the Greek armies of Alexander, even when they were outnumbered. The Greek armies of Alexander, the Persian Empire, and in 323 BC, and I think I shared this a couple weeks ago, 323 BC, so we're fast forwarding now, 323 BC, the Persians are in power still. Alexander, now the Medo-Persian Empire, they are now starting to decline, to wane, which all empires do. They were starting to lose power. The Greek Empire under Alexander the Great, do you know he never lost a battle? And as far as I know from history, he's the only king in history that never lost a battle ever. Every single battle that he went into, his troops won. How'd you like to be another empire down the block and hear Alexander's armies coming? And you're like, according to the record books, there's like a 0% chance of us winning. That was a terrifying thought. He never lost a battle. 323 BC, he walks into the palace that used to be the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. Remember, the Medo-Persians, now the Persians are in power now. They took over from the Babylonian Empire. Here the Persians controlling Babylon. Alexander walks in and says, we're here to take over. It's estimated that there were 250,000 Persians in the Persian army combined. 250,000, that's 250,000 people. Alexander had an entire troop strength of around 50,000. 250,000 against 50,000. Carry my one. Do the math. That's like a 5-to-1 ratio. There is no army on the face of the earth that can withstand a 5-to-1 ratio where the enemy has 5 troops for every one you have. Except Alexander's army wasn't any army on the face of the earth. It was the army that never lost a fight ever. And they went into battle. Alexander was a character. He, as young as he was, the guy was brilliant on the battlefield. And so his forces are coming. Here are the Persians. I wonder if anybody in Alexander's army was thinking, I know we're good, but it's like 5 times as many of them as there are of us. Maybe we shouldn't have picked this battle. Daniel says, not a problem. I got a plan. And he had done that so many times that by then, when he said he had a plan, everybody believed him. Well, of course he's got a plan. His plan was to send all of your troops to one side of this massive army buildup. And when your troops go to one side, the enemy is going to see that movement and they're going to start moving troops. The larger the army, the more complicated the moving of the troops are. We found that out in war after war. And so the Persian Empire, the Persians, now they're saying, hey, the Greeks are over there. Let's get everybody moved over there. And in the process, they're starting to move. And Alexander swings around the back, cuts through the center of them, divides the troops, and he starts slaughtering everybody. Over and over and over again. And it was all said and done, the leader of the Persian army saw what was happening, and so he did what pretty much any leader of an army that was getting slaughtered would be likely to do. You know what he did? He ran. Says, I'm done here. I'll see you guys at home. And the army, those that were left of them, said, not without me, you're not going. They turned around and hightailed it out. They all left. They ran or trotted or whatever back home where they came from to the east, and that leaves Alexander in charge of everything. He had a party, celebration party. He got drunk. He did that a lot, got drunk. He got sick. Some people say it was alcohol that made him sick. He was in a drunken stupor, and there's disagreements over exactly how it happened, but something happened. He got sick, and he died right there in Nebuchadnezzar's old palace in Babylon. Alexander was dead at the age of 33 years old. And all the generals are looking at each other saying, what do we do now? The king is gone. He's dead. What do we do now? And so you had these generals that are standing around probably in a circle saying, okay, I'll take charge. And one of them said, who in the world made you take, who said you could take charge? You're no better than the rest of us. They start having battles between themselves. The troops of the generals of Alexander's army were fighting each other to figure out who was going to be in charge, and ended up dividing up his kingdom into 6 parts. So they were fragmented, okay? So what was happening with these kingdoms, you go from the purest in terms of government, in terms of strength in the government, where one man had to say over everything. The next kingdom, which was the Medo-Persian Empire, was inferior to the Babylonian Empire because it was, well, in the first place, it was 2 empires, the Medes and the Persians. And so there's already a division. And then you add to that the fact that the way their structure of government worked was the king could make a decree, but the king didn't have the power to change his own decree. And so it was weaker in that sense. Alexander comes on the scene, takes over, young man, he dies, and now all of a sudden you have 6 different people saying, all right, I'm going to run the government. 6 different people. It was a stronger army, but a weaker system of government. And I'll tell you this, that after Alexander died, the brilliant tactician and battlefield commander that he was, none of those other generals that took over had the skill set that he did on the battlefield. And so guess what happened to the Greek Empire? It was divided up. Of all of the generals, there are 2 that we need to remember as far as biblical facts are concerned. There was a general that was up north of Israel in the area that today is Syria. Okay, his name was Seleucus. And so you ended up, what happened up there from Syria was called the Seleucid Empire. That was one of those fragmented empires that came off the Greek Empire of Alexander, the Seleucid Empire. The second general that's significant as far as Bible history is concerned was down in Egypt. His name was Ptolemy. And so down there we had the Ptolemaic Empire. And so this is interesting. Israel's always been in a place, historically, always been in a place, they're right in the middle of everything. They're in the middle of everything today too, by the way. So here's Israel with the Seleucids up in the north, the old, what was left of the Greek Empire, the Ptolemies down in the south, what was left of the old Greek Empire, each of them wanting to battle each other. And of course, for either one of them, for Ptolemy in the south to go up to Syria, or for Seleucus in the north to go down to Egypt, they had to go through, guess where? Israel, right through Jerusalem. And so these battles taking place back and forth. So Daniel here, in just one verse, verse 39, is showing this change of kingdoms for 3 different kingdoms. He says, after you will arise another kingdom inferior to you, that's the Medo-Persian Empire, and then a third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth, that's the Greek Empire. By the time Alexander conquered the Medo-Persian Empire, there wasn't hardly anybody left to conquer. He had it all. And then in verse 40, Daniel says, there will be a 4th kingdom, as strong as iron. So it's interesting when you go down through this form, from the gold at the top to the silver chest and arms to the brass belly and thighs, and then finally the iron legs. You're going from a weaker metal to a stronger metal, going from gold to silver to brass to iron. So the strength of the metal increases going down. Going down is chronologically going through the years. The strength increases, but the quality decreases. The quality of the government of Nebuchadnezzar's time was the highest quality, and when you got down to the quality of the empire of Greece that Alexander left was a very inferior quality. When we get to this 4th kingdom in verse 40, there will be a 4th kingdom as strong as iron. That is the Roman Empire. 63 BC. The Hellenization had swept across the Mediterranean world. Hellenization, of course, came from the Greek Empire. Hellenization everywhere. You still see it over there. It even affects our country. You see Corinthian columns, Ionic and Doric and Corinthian columns all over the place. Post offices, courthouses, everything else. That all came from the Greek, the Hellenization that came out of Alexander's time. So now the Roman Empire is going to take over. And the way that he classifies that in verse 40, 4th kingdom, as strong as iron. No one had ever seen anything like the imperial forces of Rome when they marched. They were incredible. They were as strong as iron. And he also says, as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things, so like iron that breaks in pieces, it will crush and break all these in pieces. So the Roman Empire, 63 BC, Pompey arrives in Jerusalem. And from that point on, Jerusalem is under the control of Rome. Fast forward 6 decades to the time of Christ. By the time that Christ was born, Jerusalem was still under the control of Rome. They had their foot on the throat of Israel. And they were despised. That's why the disciples asked Christ, is now the time you're going to take over the kingdom? You know, the Romans we hate the Romans. They're giving us all kind of trouble. Is now the time? They didn't understand what the kingdom really was. So Daniel says, all right, here's the deal, king. Start at the top. That's your kingdom. Then another kingdom is going to take over after you. That's the Medo-Persian Empire. Another kingdom is going to take over after them. That's the Greek Empire. Another kingdom, finally a 4th kingdom, is the Roman Empire. So Daniel gives this snapshot, this thumbnail sketch of what was coming ahead for the world. And it's interesting because when you read verse 40 again, there will be a 4th kingdom as strong as iron, as much as iron crushes and shatters all things. So like iron that breaks in pieces, it will crush and break all these in pieces. In that, verse 41, in that you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it will be a divided kingdom. There are, historically, there are several phases to this kingdom that was known as the Roman Empire. At the first phase was from 63 BC when the Romans took over Israel, took over Jerusalem. That was the first phase. What, 285 AD, so we're going on the other side of BC now, 285 AD, the Roman Empire then, they were already, and like I mentioned before, they were starting to stretch themselves too thin, and they were becoming weaker. And so the emperor at the time in 285 divided the kingdom. It became two kingdoms, actually, one in the west, one in the east. The kingdom in the west was headquartered in Rome. Kingdom in the east was in Byzantium, which was, you ever hear the term the Byzantine Empire? The Byzantine Empire was the eastern half of the Roman Empire. And so that massive empire that was Rome was beginning to be fractured. And that fracturing, and by the way, we are still in the time period when that kingdom exists. Right now, we're not seeing anything in the Roman Empire. I mean, over in Italy, there's still a Rome in Italy, and there's an Italian government, but it's not the kingdom. That kingdom is coming back, though, and that's in the future. So Daniel, at this point, is just giving Nebuchadnezzar this little snapshot of what's coming, and then when he gets back to chapter 7, he's going to say, okay, let's break it down and start to look at the details. Amazing. And here's Nebuchadnezzar hearing all of this, what's going to happen, what's coming ahead, and this has got to be just whirling around in his mind. Verse 42. As the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay or pottery, so some of the kingdom will be strong and part of it will be brittle. And in that you saw the iron mixed with common clay, they will combine with one another in the seed of men. Some of your versions might say with the seed of men. And what Dan is referring to there is there was a time when the Roman Empire really was a republic. It started what some people today call a democracy. In other words, ruled by the people. And so there was this, again, this was government purposes. It was inferior as far as purity from the Nebuchadnezzar Empire of Babylon down to the time of the Roman Empire. At some point in the Roman Empire, that centralized control, they don't have, after several years, they didn't have emperors anymore. They didn't have one person calling the shots. And so now the Senate and the Republic and everything else, they were making all the laws. They were making all the rules. So it had been a watered-down kingdom, which is what he's talking about here. And then he brings everything to sort of a conclusion in verse 44. He says, in the days of those kings, what kings? How many toes did you have on your feet? 5 on each, that's 10 toes. In the days of those 10 kings, which hadn't happened yet, and by the way, still hasn't yet happened today. This is still future. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. And that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but it will itself endure forever. And verse 44 is referring to the millennial kingdom of Christ that will be established when Christ will reign from Jerusalem. Interesting, and I'll close with this, the end of verse 44. But it will itself endure forever. And people have often said, the millennial kingdom is 1,000 years. That's not forever, right? The word is translated forever. It's an Aramaic word, but there's a Hebrew equivalent. It's olam, which means until a point or unto a point. And it doesn't literally mean forever like we would think of, like there's no end to it. The word literally means for a season, a fixed season. And so this last kingdom that he's talking about, which is the millennial kingdom, it says the God of heaven is going to set up this kingdom, and it will last for a season, and in fact, it will last for 1,000 years. And we'll get into much more of that when we get down to the later chapters. Okay, I think that was the second buzzer. I finally heard a buzzer, so let's close in prayer. Father, thank you for our time together this morning. Thank you for this book of Daniel and for where he begins to lead prophetically and start to make connections to what we will be studying in the book of Revelation, Lord. We thank you for our time together and ask that you, as you dismiss us from this class, and we look forward to our worship service. We give you praise that we're able to gather together, and we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.